Chris, can you hear us?
You bet. I can hear you. Thank you.
Hey, Chris. George Chambers again this year. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
You are speaking to a very distinguished group here, the convention attendees at RKF USA. A tremendous crowd this year. I mean, we got a banquet hall full of people. This is a new RKF, and so we're certainly looking forward to hearing from you again. I told them that my ADD kicks in a whole lot, but when I had the opportunity to get a copy of your book and read it, it's one of those that I can't put down. So I certainly enjoyed it. I know last year a lot of people got copies of it, have got copies since and read it, recommended it to their friends. So we're certainly looking forward to hearing from you, and hopefully towards the end perhaps we'll have an opportunity for some questions and answers, if that's okay with you.
Oh, that's great.
All right, well, I'm going to turn it over to you, sir.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I would like to leave a lot of time for Q&A because I think that'll be the most helpful. And first of all, I really want to start by apologizing. I really wish I could be there with you today. It sounds like a great convening of people. To be honest, I am on the ground one day today between reporting trips for a new book I'm working on, which has got me on the road a lot. And it just is a brutal schedule. I'm not just under deadline, but behind deadline. But I always just really appreciate your work, and I'm so sorry I can't be there with you today. But I'm glad we can talk, and I'd like to reiterate the point that everybody should at least buy the Meat Racket, whether or not you're going to read it. I think that's something important to remember, but that's a joke, obviously. I can't really hear everybody laughing. I hope that went over okay. But, you know, I thought it would be useful today to talk about some of the reporting in the Meat Racket and the really important lessons that I think it has for the independent cattle rancher of today and some of the work that RCAF is doing. And, you know, full disclosure at the beginning, I was born and raised in Kansas City, Missouri. I haven't worked a day of my life on a ranch, even though I've worked on farms before. I've never lived in a city smaller than 20,000 people. And sometimes I still have to go to the internet to remind myself of the difference between a steer and a heifer. So all this together might make you wonder what in the world I would have to tell you that might be of use to a group of ranchers who lives and breathes this business every day. And my answer to that is that as a reporter, you know, my day job is getting to go talk to people in very different walks of life. You know, all of us get very absorbed in our day-to-day life, and we kind of live in a silo of our job and our families and our community. But being a reporter has given me the chance to sort of bounce from silo to silo and talk to different people involved in an industry from different perspectives. And I think the job of a reporter is to take all that information and synthesize it into one place where other people can read about it. And that's what I tried to do in the Meat Racket. Or to put it all in a lot more concise way, I went and spent a lot of time on chicken farms so that you all didn't have to. And I think that what I learned there was really important. The book, The Meat Racket, begins and is chiefly preoccupied with the modern U.S. poultry industry. And there's a reason for that. You know, this book started when I was a business reporter working in the Midwest back in 2004, and I saw the modern poultry industry for the first time and was really shocked by what I saw. Not in the scope of the operations or how animals were treated, but the way people were treated and the economic realities of it. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. But suffice it to say, I spent years traveling primarily through the South and the Southeast, states like Arkansas, Georgia, Mississippi, reporting on the poultry industry there. And as I worked on this book over time, I really realized that the Meat Racket is sort of like a message in a bottle. And that message is written specifically for people like you. My wife reminded me that as I was finishing this book, I said, you know, this thing is really written for independent cattle ranchers because they are the last people on the frontier of having open markets and competition and some amount of independence and transparency. You know, what has happened in the poultry industry unfortunately might not be reversible. It's a difficult problem to figure out how to change what's going on in the poultry industry. But if one silver lining can come out of this, it's that independent ranchers of today can learn the lessons of what happened in the poultry industry and apply them to what's happening in the cattle industry as it moves forward. I don't need to tell you, there are lots of changes afoot constantly in the business. And the one element I think that's really important for us to think about is the structure of the market. That's really what I'm writing about in the book, The Meat Racket, is the structure of the market. I'm not writing about greed or, one person treating another badly. I'm writing about the sort of inevitable effects that occur when you have a highly consolidated market where only a few firms control the market, and a market that is at the same time very tightly vertically integrated. I'm sure I don't need to dive into what that means for this crowd. You're familiar with what vertical integration is. But all of these lessons, and this is all kind of sounds wonky, I guess, but all of these lessons for me started by studying the poultry industry. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what I saw that led me to write The Meat Racket. For me, it really all started back in 2004 when I was a business reporter in Arkansas. And I went to this little town called Waldron, Arkansas, which was home to a very large Tyson Foods poultry plant. I mean, we're talking large scale, processed about 1 million chickens a week, supplied large fast food chains like Kentucky Fried Chicken. It was supported by hundreds of large scale industrial poultry farms. This was a big operation with lots of money. What struck me as I went down there and traveled around Waldron was the state of the farmers there. I drove from farm to farm and interviewed people about their business and what it was like. There's no other way to put it other than that I was really horrified by what I saw. These folks I met with were Scott County, Arkansas farmers. I mean, these were independent-minded, hardworking people who just sort of took it for granted that a work week was 7 days long. They didn't mind putting in a lot of labor. They were very committed to staying on their land. They're very committed to the business of animal agriculture. But it was just striking how almost to a person, they lived in an atmosphere of intimidation and fear and real powerlessness. It struck me to visit these farms and talk with folks. I remember one guy who was probably 6'4" and could have crushed my head in the palm of his hand. His name was Greg Owens. He looked like he just walked out of a Civil War portrait. And when he talked about Tyson Foods, his shoulders would slump and he would just get this real defeated tone in his voice. And this was because Tyson Foods had essentially unilaterally put him out of business. This guy had borrowed hundreds of thousands of dollars to build a large-scale industrial poultry farm under contract with Tyson Foods and was put out of business in a matter of months, really through no actions of his own. And I became fascinated with this question of how could we reach this place? How could we reach a place where so many farmers could be under the thumb of one company to such a degree that they're literally afraid to talk about that company in the privacy of their own living room, or to the degree that they could end up like a guy I met named Jerry Yandell, who'd been in the business for 30 years and in a matter of about 6 months got put out of business because Tyson Foods delivered sick birds to him. Again, this wasn't any shortfall on Jerry Yandell's part. This was the fact that the company delivered sick birds to him and he had so little power that he was put out of business. Over time, I realized that the problems I was seeing had nothing to do with the chicken farmers themselves or the business of raising chickens. There's money to be made in raising chickens. History shows that. What I was seeing were what I call dysfunctions in the shape of the market. Tyson Foods would like to say that, when I went down to Waldron, I kind of stumbled into this one lot of bad apples, of people who didn't want to work hard or who had an axe to grind against the company. But that really wasn't the case. I went from town to town, Arkansas, Missouri, Georgia, North Carolina, and what you see is that these problems in the poultry industry are systemic. They're the way the system is built, and they're due to the way the market is built. And the two key things that killed the chicken farmer are this. One, the tight vertical integration of the business, which I know you're familiar with that concept. Tyson Foods owns the bird, they own the slaughterhouse, they own the animal feed, they own the medicine that goes to the animals. And the poultry farmer over time has become something of a animal babysitter, if you will. They watch the birds for 6 weeks, and then Tyson comes and delivers them. Vertical integration in and of itself isn't evil. It's not even necessarily destructive. The problem comes when you have such tight integration that is coupled with horizontal integration. That's a mergers and acquisition. That's consolidation in the market. That's what happens when Tyson Foods starts buying out its competitors over many years in the 1980s and 1990s. You know, back in the 1970s, 36 poultry companies controlled about half of the U.S. market. 36 companies divvied up half the market. Today, three companies divvy up half of the market. Tyson, Pilgrim's Pride, and Purdue, or Sanderson, depending on how you slice those last two. That's a tremendous amount of consolidation, and you know the results of this are predictable. As there's less and less competition, the power dynamics accrue to the favor of the poultry integrator, right? The power dynamic when you write a contract goes in favor of the company. And what we saw, and what was documented really well, frankly, over a period of 40 years, is that as we saw this consolidation and as we saw these mergers, the terms of poultry farming became more and more detrimental to the farmer. And I mean, why wouldn't it? If you were Tyson Foods, wouldn't you want to write the poultry contract in your favor? Well, this is what we saw, is that as the farmers had less and less choice of who to do business with, the terms of their contracts became more and more onerous. The length of the contracts became shorter, and the terms became much more favorable to the poultry company. I'll walk through one quick example that's kind of important and illustrative, I think, which is this so-called tournament system. I won't belabor this because I feel like you folks probably are familiar with this, but it's worth talking about. You know, in that town of Waldron, about 100 farms will deliver chickens to the slaughterhouse every week. And rather than getting paid on a price per pound basis, the farmers are paid on a so-called tournament system. And what that means is at the central office in the Tyson plant, they collect amazing amounts of data on every farm. The information that Tyson has about the farms dwarfs the information that the farmer has by a factor of 100 to 1. Tyson Foods knows the weight of the birds that was delivered, the kind of feed that was delivered, the quality of the feed. They know the weight of the birds when they arrive back at the slaughterhouse to be killed. And what Tyson does at the end of every week is it tallies up how each farmer did. In other words, they tally up how fat the chickens got based on the amount of feed that they ate, and then Tyson ranks the farmers against each other and pays them in a ranking system. If I'm at the top, I get a bonus. If I'm in the middle, I get a base pay. If I'm at the bottom, I get a pay cut. Now, heck, that sounds great in a lot of ways. It sounds like capitalism. It sounds like competition, and there's a lot to recommend that. But it's when you dig into the specifics of how the tournament works that you realize it's really not at all about competition or quality. It's truly about control. This is because of two reasons. First of all, the primary means by which you do well or do poorly in the tournament, the primary criteria is the health of the birds that get delivered and the quality of the feed. Anybody in the business will tell you that. So what that means is that the prime conditions for success or failure have to do entirely with the quality of the birds that Tyson delivers and the quality of feed that it delivers. That is entirely outside the hands of the farmer. Secondly, there's no transparency whatsoever to this system. If I'm the farmer and I get my tournament ranking sheet, all I see is my name in the ranking. I don't see the names of anybody else I competed against. I just see the number of where I ranked and what my pay is going to be. So that's a tremendous, what they call an information asymmetry. The company knows who competed against each other, but the farmer has no idea against whom they competed. That means the farmer can't learn, okay, my neighbor Jake did XYZ and did much better in the ranking, so I'll try to do that. It's a blind contest on the farmer's half. And then thirdly, and very importantly, the tournament is a zero-sum game. And what I mean by that is the winnings of those top farmers are taken from the pay of the bottom farmers. It's not just that the best performers get a bonus and the bottom performers get a pay cut. It's that the pay cut from the bottom farmers goes to the top farmers. What that means for Tyson is that they know exactly what they're going to pay out for a given batch. The volatility of who gets what is not on Tyson. They're going to take the pay from the bottom and give it to the top. So Tyson can predict their pay, but the farmer can't predict their own pay. What that does is shifts the volatility of raising the birds. It shifts the volatility of the quality of the baby chicks and the quality of the feed right on to the farmer. Tyson can predict what they're going to pay. The farmer can never predict what they're going to be paid from one flock to another. Now, to kind of bring this all together, I was really struck when I interviewed a former senior executive from Tyson Foods who helped build the contract system and the tournament system, who helped implement it for years. And he was really candid with me. He said, you know, yeah, sure, part of this is about getting the farmer to work hard and try to compete, but it's mostly about keeping the farmer under the power of Tyson. It keeps them under the necessity of having to constantly upgrade their housing, upgrade their equipment, borrow more money to put in new fans, borrow more money to put in new feeders, new watering systems. It keeps them under the control of Tyson. So Tyson can control the one element of the whole system that they don't own, which is the actual physical farm itself. So fine, let's leave that there. The tournament system, in my view, is a pretty negative system, but it's not inevitable. And this brings us to what's important, I think, for animal agriculture outside of the poultry industry. What's happening in the chicken business is bleeding over into beef and pork, as you well know. And the whole second part of the meat racket is about how Tyson Foods took this blueprint of the poultry industry and just set it right on top of the hog industry in the 1980s and 1990s. And now it wasn't just Tyson. You had Smithfield, Premium Standard Farms, Murphy Family Farms. All these companies worked very hard to vertically integrate the hog industry and make it look a lot like the poultry industry. And to a large degree, they succeeded. You know, back in the 70s, the hog industry looked a lot like the cattle industry. It had an open cash market that was very vigorous with a spot price that traded every day. There were lots of independent producers. The net income of hog farmers in the late 70s was close to $8 billion a year. It was a good business with good money. And it was radically transformed during the 80s and 90s. Now the spot market is essentially gone. Spot sales represent a tiny percentage of hog sales every year. Over 75% of the hogs that are raised under contract for a company like Tyson or Smithfield. Here's what's pertinent to our discussion. Here's what's interesting to me. You know, Iowa, the state of Iowa was ground zero for the vertical integration of the hog industry. And in the 1990s, Smithfield tried to impose a tournament system on its hog farmers in the state. They tried to take that tournament payment from the South, from the poultry farms, and apply it to the hog business. They didn't succeed for reasons that are really interesting to me. What happened in Iowa is that hog farmers actually got together and discussed what was happening with one another. And they formed producer groups where they could pool information, where they could look at each other's contracts, where they could compare notes, and where they could kind of formulate demands that they wanted. Furthermore, in the state of Iowa, you had an attorney general named Tom Miller who was really committed to keeping competition and transparency in the hog market. As these vertically integrated firms started to roll in, Tom Miller took some pretty extraordinary actions. He sued Murphy Family Farms in Smithfield, for example, to try to break that chain of ownership between the slaughterhouse and the hog farm. Miller reached settlements that had requirements that really helped farmers. For example, they would post contracts to a state-run website, so there was some level of transparency. Farmers could see the contracts that their neighbors had. This is absolutely not the case for poultry farmers in the South, where contracts are confidential, where the tournament ranking sheets are also confidential, where a farmer could literally be sued for showing the contract to an attorney to get outside perspective, or by comparing tournament sheets with their neighbors. Tom Miller in Iowa introduced a level of transparency, and he also showed that regulatory authorities like the Attorney General were willing to fight on grounds of keeping competition and market transparency. And this had a marked effect. These hog farmers who got together with one another back in the 1990s formulated a position and then went back to Smithfield Foods and said, you know what? This tournament system is unfair to us. It shifts volatility from your balance sheet onto our balance sheet, and we don't want to operate with this sort of system. Smithfield relented, and today there's not a tournament system in hog farming in Iowa. Instead, farmers are paid sometimes on a price per pound basis, or they're even paid just on quote-unquote shackle space, which you're paid on a rate of how many hogs you raise. And to me, what's so instructive is that you bet Smithfield is making a lot of money in that state. The tournament system isn't necessary for viable animal agriculture or even for profitability of the integrator. To me, what this story says is that market conditions and regulatory behavior can change the shape of animal agriculture's marketplace. In Iowa, you had more transparency, more competition, and you had regulators who were willing to stand up to the big, what we would call the big packers, Smithfield, Murphy Family Farms. And that kept some of the worst behavior at bay, and it changed the shape of the market. Now, another key point I want to make here before moving on is that in the hog farm and the hog farming business in Iowa, it used to be independent with a cash market before it was vertically integrated. So the companies had less bargaining power. You know, there was still a spot market for these hog farmers to say, hey, if I don't like the terms of your contract, I'm going to turn around to the spot market and sell my animal there. The spot market was something of an escape hatch. It provided a transparent price that these farmers could use. And I think that that was a key element in holding off some of the worst behavior of these packers like Smithfield, Premium Standard Farms, and even Tyson Foods. And, you know, maybe saying worst behavior is a little bit biased because these companies are just going to write the contracts in their favor every time. I mean, that's what they're going to do. But it's up to other people to decide what kind of shape of the market that we want. So this brings me to maybe a good point of discussion and a point that I think might be a little bit controversial, and that's the role of regulators in this market, and it's the role of antitrust law. Nobody likes government regulation because government regulation can be completely ineffective, counterproductive, and stupid is the only way to put it. Really complex laws that try to micromanage the way people run their businesses almost always cause more harm than they seek to benefit. And that's a fact. But, full disclosure, like politically, I would call myself a Franklin Delano Roosevelt Democrat. That's where I'm coming from. And the more I've studied the marketplace, the more I've come to the conclusion that strong antitrust enforcement really can help markets maintain their competition and transparency. And that helps create more opportunity for the people in those markets. Antitrust law is the one field of law that is intentionally pro-capitalist. The whole goal is to keep markets open so that entrepreneurs can enter the market, can compete based on their ideas and their hard work. They can succeed or they can fail, but the market remains open to competition. When there's not strict antitrust enforcement, I think what you tend to see is really large degrees of concentration of ownership. That's what you see in the poultry industry today, where all these mergers were allowed to go through. You've seen a closing out of opportunity and open markets. And the problem is, once a business becomes as consolidated as the poultry industry becomes, the market forces can't solve some of the market problems. The laws of supply and demand do not work well when you've got an oligopoly of companies that control the markets. Unfortunately, you need that undesirable remedy of government intervention. And I don't think that that's going to play well to a crowd in the upper plains of the Midwest. But it's the conclusion I've come to, that you need intervention at certain points in the marketplace to keep competition open and to solve the problems of monopoly power and oligopoly power, which is what you have when a few firms control so much of the market. Now, I'm sure you're all aware, in 2010, the Obama administration tried to pass this sweeping reform, the so-called GIPSA rule that I'm sure everybody in here is familiar with. In retrospect, there were certainly problems with that effort and with that proposed remedy. But at least it was an effort, in my opinion, that moved in the direction toward stronger antitrust enforcement. And as you know, that effort essentially failed entirely. And the meat packers emerged from that business in chicken, beef, and pork, maybe even stronger than they were prior to 2010. And the effort to insert competition was hindered a great deal by that, I think. Now, that doesn't mean that the effort's not important. And that kind of brings us to the final thing I'd like to talk about, which is that when the GIPSA rule effort fell apart in Congress in 2010, the common wisdom at the time was, wow, that's the end of antitrust reforms in the field of animal agriculture. The big meat packers who spent millions of dollars to lobby their congresspeople are too powerful. The status quo is almost impossible to fight. And to be totally honest, as I wrote the Meat Racket, I thought that I was going to be writing the story of modern day antitrust enforcement increasing and so-called trust busters going into the meat industry and breaking apart the big poultry companies, breaking apart things like the tournament system. And I was absolutely shocked to see how much power the big meat packers had in killing that effort. I mean, in killing the effort to do stuff that would have helped hardworking farmers in Scott County, Arkansas, who labor under the tournament system every day. I don't know how that's a political loser to propose that you give farmers the ability to compete in an open market. Yet somehow that's the decision that Congress made, was that they are going to help keep the markets closed and uncompetitive and serve the interest of a few companies like Tyson Foods. Now, don't hold it against me, but I live in Washington, D.C. today. I tried to hold out as long as I could as a reporter in St. Louis, but the job market for reporters is far worse even than the job market, I think, for chicken farmers, if I'm being totally honest. And there weren't that many jobs, and I had to move out here to Washington, D.C. to support my work. And I will tell you that in the last 8 months, the common wisdom of Washington, D.C. has been absolutely blown asunder. The game table has been flipped over. It is impossible to overstate the political changes that have happened in the last 8 months because of the Trump election. And there is no longer the feeling really on any front that the status quo is unbreakable. The feeling in this town, I think, today is that the mood is completely unpredictable. And what seemed unfathomable a year ago is now totally possible. And what's so fascinating to me about Donald Trump is that his positions don't break down neatly between Republican and Democrat, as you very well know. And some of his language around antitrust enforcement has been very strong in the pro-competition sense. And he's spoken in a way, frankly, that's more antitrust than Barack Obama ever did. Barack Obama and his Attorney General, Eric Holder, were accommodationists, in essence, to the big trusts and to the big, what I consider to be monopolies in the livestock business. But Trump has spoken very forcefully against monopoly power. So I'm saying that to say that it's really an open question today about how we might structure our livestock markets going forward. And some of the problems documented in the meat racket might be up for debate again. But the major problem with the Trump administration is that it is simply impossible to predict not only what the policy stance is, but what the policy stance is going to be tomorrow. It is very hard to figure out where the U.S. Department of Agriculture is headed on any issue, let alone the issue of antitrust enforcement in agriculture. And I would be very skeptical of anybody who tells me this is where the Trump administration stands on X issue. I think that the Trump administration is a black box that's hard to see into, and it's hard to determine where they stand on any given issue. But there is a lot of material that might make us think this administration would be more open to antitrust enforcement than even Democratic or Republican administrations that came before it. And maybe to close out, because I'd really like to spend more time taking questions and having more of a discussion, frankly, because I'm worried a lot of the stuff I'm telling you, you know already. But to close out, nobody put me up to saying this, but I really do want to emphasize this point of how important RCAF is. You know, when I was a reporter with the Associated Press in St. Louis, just starting to learn about this business, I got into contact with this gentleman who I'd never met before, who I think lived in South Dakota, named Bill Bullard. And he would keep me on the phone for a half hour or an hour at a time, patiently explaining to me the market dynamics in the field of livestock production and the cattle business. And I can tell you, having reported in this field for a long time and now living here in Washington somewhat against my will, RCAF is really the only group that represents independent cattle ranchers that talks about the issues of market structure. This is an important voice, and there's not another voice talking about this stuff in the cattle space. I'm smart enough not to talk a lot about the NCBA at an RCAF convention, but let's just say whatever they're doing, they're advocating their issues, and they're a very well-funded group here in Washington, but they're not talking about this issue of market structure in a real deep way. And I think one of the most important things that's going to affect the life of a cattle rancher over the next 30 years is the shape of the market in the cattle business. The meat racket starts with poultry farmers, then talks about hog farmers, and then it ends with cattle farmers. And that's very intentional. Cattle ranching is the last frontier of independent livestock production in the United States, period, full stop. It's the last area where you have lots of independent producers, where you have some semblance of a spot market, as small as it's getting. You still have a cash market. You still have some level of competition and independence. And plus, it's a group of very stubborn people who don't tend to like to be told what to do. And therefore, they haven't been swallowed entirely into this vertically integrated system that now runs the poultry business and the hog business. So that's a long way of saying these issues of market structure are vitally important. They're most important to cattle producers. And I truly think RCAF is one of the most important voices, both in the Midwest and in Washington, talking about this issue. So I'm really glad that all of you are there meeting each other and connecting here this weekend, and then hopefully being re-energized to go back home and continue this work and continue this conversation. And let me finally say that I just recently talked to some folks in the what you I guess would call the how do I put this? More in line with the lobbyists who support the big meat packers, okay? And even they were starting to kind of shake their heads and think about this. I don't think anyone in the cattle business wants to see it become the new poultry business. And we're all aware of that. So it's vitally important to keep this discussion going and keep this debate going, and for all cattle ranchers to be speaking with one another about this. And I'm really grateful that RCAF is out there keeping this story alive and keeping this message out. So with that, it'd be a good time to take some questions if anybody has some. And if you don't, I can just start talking again.
Hey, Chris, George Chambers again.
Okay.
You were thanking us. Thank you for bringing this to light on a national stage through your book. We are going to have time for just a few questions. The mics on either side of the room are hot. If you don't mind, as a courtesy to Chris, when you go up, if you'll give him your name and kind of where you're from, and Chris will go through a couple, 3 questions. We appreciate it.
Okay. Sorry if I went on too long.
No, you're good. You're good.
Chris, this is Dudley Butler. Glad to talk to you again.
Likewise.
Could you explain how, with vertical integration, it always centers on the area of concentration of the animals? In beef, it's a feedlot. And so could you explain how the shrinking of the ownership of the feedlots makes the calf people more susceptible?
Absolutely. That's a vital point. As you can tell, I try to stay away from talking about ranching to a room full of ranchers because you know this business better than I do. But this is a vitally important point. I think of it as a pyramid. At the base of the pyramid, you've got all these ranchers out there doing cow-calf operations on grass and raising the animals. And then, as you know, in the last 6 months of the animal's life, or however many months, they're going to live on a feedlot. And that's like the point of the pyramid. You've got all these producers and all these animals funneling down to fewer and fewer feedlots and then packers on the other side of that feedlot. What that's doing is creating what I call a kind of de facto vertical integration. Because as you know, more and more cattle at those feedlots are now purchased under contract, not on the spot market. Now, I know for a fact these companies like Tyson Foods, back in the 70s, back in the 80s, they experimented with taking over the cattle ranch, with doing it like a chicken house or a modern day hog house. And they couldn't break the code on how to economically confine the animals from birth to death like they do with chickens. So the strategy they settled on instead was to consolidate at the buyer end, which they've done very, very well. As you know, 4 companies buy 85% of the beef, and then buy the animals under contract rather than on the spot market under the grid system that pioneered by IBP, now Tyson. Here's what that means. If I own a large feedlot in Dodge City, Kansas, I've got at best 3 slaughterhouses I can sell the animal to. But in reality, oftentimes you've got 1 slaughterhouse to sell to. And that means that you're starting as that feedlot owner to accept contract terms that are more and more similar to poultry contracts. Now, what that means is the livestock owner is starting to obey the needs of that contract. Instead of just developing a great animal that has the attributes that would sell on an open market, they're just trying to meet the specifications of the grid contract or whatever contract it is more and more and more. It's become an issue not of market competition, but of bargaining power. And that is going to ripple down. It's going to ripple downstream out through that pyramid from the fewer number of feedlots out to the cow-calf rancher, because the feedlot owner is only going to be able to get such an amount of dollar per head for certain kind of cattle, and all of that pressure is going to translate down the chain to everybody else. And to me, the really problematic dynamic of having so few buyers is, again, that the factors in the market aren't open competition and price signals on a spot market, but bargaining power. It's what price can that feedlot owner get based on the bargaining power they have with the packer. And as the packers consolidate more and more, they can drive down that bargaining power. And again, that's going to ripple down through the chain. Does that roughly answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Chris, this is Taylor Haynes from Wyoming.
Good. Hi.
Great. Thank you for your time. It appears to me that we're in the same situation that the telecommunications industry was in 20, 30 years ago. And my question to you, now that you're matriculating in the swamp, do you see avenues by which we can take the same approach by which they broke up Ma Bell? Because what we need, we love packing houses. We just want thousands more. We love feedlots. We just want thousands more. Is there a way we can get that idea into Congress and to the administration?
I couldn't agree with you more. I hate the title of my book, The Meat Racket, because it makes it sound like I'm saying the whole meat industry is bad or something. And as you know, there's so much of this idea out there like, oh my God, you know, what are they doing? But it's about having 1,000 packing houses, more competition, more openness. Now, how do you start to unring the bell of consolidation? That you know what you're talking about, breaking up these companies along the lines of breaking up AT&T, particularly for the poultry industry, might be one of the only solutions. And the problem is, it's a really hard solution. I will never forget sitting at the first big public hearing of the Obama effort in Ankeny, Iowa. I was in a room with Eric Holder, the Attorney General, and Christine Varney, the head of Antitrust Enforcement. This was day one of the effort. And on that day, they said, oh no, we're not going to consider breaking up the companies. So they were starting from the bargaining position of not wanting to enact that. And everybody needs to corner Dudley Butler because he knows 10 times more about this whole thing than I do. But what I'm saying is even the most intense reform effort of the last 10 years didn't even consider breaking up the companies, but that might be the only solution we have. Again, I can't overemphasize, the Trump election has thrown common wisdom out the window. People are tired of feeling like the economic system is rigged. They're tired of feeling like hard work doesn't reward them anymore. And so how do you get this idea across in Congress? First of all, this sounds so glib, but the truth is you just keep talking about it. A group like RCAF, who are real people in the business every day, need to advocate for this position. And I think it needs to be advocated for in the terms that it really is, which is pro-capitalism, competition, entrepreneurship, making money, not having centralized control of a business. This is red, white, and blue American stuff. And I think it just needs to be advocated for in the framework of making more money for more people. And the effectiveness of that, I'm just not qualified to comment on because nobody knows where the American federal government is going to be on this issue 6 months from now, 1 year from now, or 2 years from now. But all that being said, I think the only solution is to push among your friends and to your congressperson and to other members of Congress the idea that we need to take big action to increase competition and transparency in this market. And, you know, I've studied the period in the 1920s when they broke up the meat trust that existed back then. And there's good news and bad news. The good news is they did it. They broke up the meat trust of the 19-teens. They broke it up and created a lot of competition. The bad news is that efforts like this can take 10 years. It takes a concerted effort. It takes a lot of time. And so the ultimate end goal is we need to build the political consensus that this is a good thing for the economy and a good thing for the rancher. And once that's done, politicians will follow.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, Mr. Leonard, I'm a chairman of the Sheep Committee here for RCAF, and I'm also president of the South Dakota Stock Growers. One of the things that I've seen for many years is we hear our Congress talking about anti-regulatory, and the thing that I'm seeing is we try to prevent regulation of our corporations, and instead we're installing regulation on the individuals, tax structure on the individuals, so we can't make money enough to create the economy that we need. And I wondered if you would comment on that.
Amen. First of all, that's exactly how I see things. And that's a huge story we could talk about a long time, but that is exactly the case. Washington, D.C. is like a spider that just can't stop spinning web. And that web is all these regulations. But if you can have a lobbyist in Washington, you can steer the regulatory machine away from your business. And what this means is that the middle class and the workers are getting more and more regulatory burden put on their shoulders, while at key points in our economy, the regulatory burden is smaller and smaller and smaller every year, such as trading derivatives or commodities, for example. My answer to this is that earlier I said I was an FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt Democrat. I think the New Deal was a very smart package of regulation. Even though it increased the reach of government, here's how it did it. It created regulations that were dramatic and strong, but very well aimed at the peaks of economic power. For example, this law called Glass-Steagall broke up the way big banks operated. It had investment banks on one side and commercial banks for consumers on another side. And so it was a regulation that was very strong, but very simple and targeted a point of power in the economy, not your everyday Joe going in with a bank account at the corner bank, but the Goldman Sachs and the JP Morgans. Those are the kind of regulations that can create more openness in the economic system, and needs to be more targeted at those junctures in the economy where economic power is really consolidated. So to me, the point is to reduce the regulatory burden on the independent business owner, but use regulations like a laser beam at the points of the economy that are very important, such as mergers of big meat companies, or the Obama administration tried to reformulate the tournament system and how it could work. Now, something like that might be a burden on the shoulders of Tyson Foods, but it's going to open up a lot of opportunity for poultry farmers. So I think the goal is well-targeted regulation that has the purpose of increasing competition and economic growth.
Chris, thank you so very much for your time, sir. Let's give him a round of applause.
Good. Can I ask him one more question? Can I ask him just one question there?
They got me going, Skip. I'm sorry, buddy. I'm sorry. Yeah, hold on.
Yeah.
Yeah, Chris, they're asking, do they have a way to contact you? Do you have a number or an email or something?
You bet. First of all, my website is christopherleonard.biz, and you've got all my email and everything on that website. But my email is a little confusing. It's C. Leonard, like Chris Leonard, C. Leonard News, all one word, C. Leonard News @gmail.com. And email me anytime, but you can particularly find me at christopherleonard.biz and email me anytime. And I'm sorry if I didn't leave enough time for Q&A. I just get rolling on this
No,
stuff.
and we appreciate all your comments. Yes, Bill Bullard is sitting right here next to me, and he says that we will restructure this thing so there'll be even more time next year.
All right. Hopefully I can make it. I'm sorry to have to do this.
Yes,
via
we
video.
would love to have you here because we'll probably just spend the afternoon listening to you. So,
That sounds great.
all right. Well, thank you
Well,
so very, very much.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Okay.